Next is Fortuity and Fortune, contextualizing the golden age of the Nabateans. And our speaker is La Sierra's very own Mr. Archaeology. Kent Bramlett got his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2009, and he's professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity here at La Sierra, where he has taught since 2010. He is chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology and director of graduate studies in archaeology, where he supervises the theses of our master's students. He is curator of the archaeology collections and associate director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. Having earned this PhD in Near Eastern Archaeology at the University of Toronto, specializing in late Bronze Age. He's co-director of the Mataba Plains Project excavation at Tel El Ameri, as well as at the Bulua Regional Archaeological Project, both in Jordan. He's published numerous articles in the field. At La Sierra University, he teaches courses in archaeology and ancient Near Eastern languages, Hebrew, Akkadian, Egyptian, basically whatever you need, and is involved in the application of emerging technology to archaeological research. So we're very privileged to have Kent Bramlett on staff and look forward to your presentation, Kent.
Well, I probably bit off more than I can chew in trying to summarize, say, 400 years of Nabatean history here, but I will give it a shot. So, fortuity and fortune. Fortuity first, and the resulting fortune that ensued from wise pursuit of those fortuitous opportunities. The story is told of young Alexander of Macedon, not yet the Great, gathering incense to throw into the altar fire while sacrificing at the temple under the watch of his tutor, Leonidas of Epirus. Leonidas was tutor in Alexander's younger years, before Aristotle taught him in his sort of mid-teen years. According to Plutarch's Life of Alexander, the boy grabbed extravagant fistfuls of the precious incense with both hands to offer the gods, whereupon Leonidas chided Alexander to be more sparing until such a time as he might conquer the region, producing the valuable commodity. Or in the 1919 translation by Perrin, Alexander, when thou hast conquered the spice-bearing regions, thou canst be thus lavish with thine incense. Now, however, use sparingly what thou hast. Has a bit of a ring to it, right? One might fault Plutarch with a penchant for the dramatic, but in his account of Alexander's military campaign down the Phoenician coastal lands, capturing Tyre, and then onward to lay siege to Gaza, the Roman author reports that reaching the storehouses of Gaza, the port from which much of the incense and spices was shipped to European lands, that Alexander sent back to the now elderly Leonidas 500 talents of frankincense and 100 talents of myrrh, with the message, I have sent you myrrh and frankincense in abundance that you may stop dealing parsimoniously with the gods. This would amount to near 20 tons in our units of weight. A talent varies different times and regions, but give or take, it's like a big sack of horse feed in weight, about 70 pounds. It was not the land of its origin, but the message to his childhood tutor was clear. He was fulfilling his destiny. Who were these desert caravanners bringing camel loads of rare goods across desert lands from Arabia to the Mediterranean? It was, in fact, an officer in Alexander's regiments, Hieronymus of Cardia, who later wrote a life history of the regions he had traversed and the peoples encountered. Though his work is long lost, parts were copied in the extensive writings of Diodorus Siculus, or Diodorus of Sicily, who lived in the mid-1st century BC. It is quoted, in it he quoted parts of Hieronymus of Cardia's work, and describes the Nabateans as nomads who trafficked in the exotic goods and products of Arabia, Africa, and India, and notes that they practiced no agriculture or viticulture, and that they lived in tents. He says they lived in the open air, claiming as native land a wilderness that had neither rivers nor abundant springs from which it is possible for a hostile army to obtain water. It is their custom neither to plant grain nor set out any fruit-bearing tree or use vines or construct any house. While there are many Arab tribes who use the desert as pasture, the Nabateans far surpass the others in wealth, although they are not much more than 10,000 in number. For not a few of them are accustomed to bring down to the sea frankincense and myrrh and the most valuable kinds of spices, which they procure from those who convey them from what is called Arabia Eudaimonia, or Eudaimon. It's the Arabia Felix in Latin. This seems to reflect accurately the origins of the Nabateans, who would be described after a cultural transformation by Strabo in the early 1st century AD as a people living in stone houses, practicing intensive agriculture, in contrast to the earlier tents and no agriculture. Wine now takes a central place in society and religious life, and grapes and the vine become a most popular motif in sculpture and painting. So the Nabateans step into the pages of history. Where did they come from? Theories vary. Connections with a people mentioned by the Assyrians posit a migration from the Mesopotamian regions, but has more recently been rejected on linguistic arguments. Suggestions of a southern Arabian origin are somewhat more plausible. Let's see if this is going forward. There we go. One more. There we go. Suggestions of a southern Arabian origin are somewhat more plausible, but still unconvincing, as we know about the Sabians and others who populated that region. More likely, they find their origins among the tribes and clans of the Hejaz region, in the northwest mountains and desert wastes of the Arabian Peninsula. You can see there on the map, it's highlighted. What we do know is that they came to dominate the overland trade from southern Arabia to the western markets. And they settled at the site now called Petra in modern Jordan, which became their capital and financial center. Okay. In 312 BC, Antigonus Monophthalmus, sometimes just called the Cyclops, because he had one eye after his battles, one of the former generals of Alexander, now vying for power and territory, sent his army under his friend Athenaeus to campaign in the region of the Arabs, who are called the Nabatea. There, he said, they looted a place called the Rock, which in Greek is Petra, and Petra equates with an older term, Selah, in the local languages, and referred originally not to the large town Petra would become, but to the older Edomite acrosite now called al-Biara, and Larry Herr pointed that out in one of his pictures. This Iron Age mountaintop redoubt, and others somewhat like it, were places where the locals could escape and may even have lived part of the year. As the Nabateans moved into this region, displacing, assimilating, and otherwise coexisting with the residual Edomites, the name of the place remains, so that when Antigonus campaigned there, we can identify the region and the people, but we can't say a lot yet about the infrastructure. And here on the top right, you can see al-Biara, and here's some of the archaeological excavations up on the top dating to the Edomite period. So this Battle of 312 presents the emergence of the Nabateans on the political stage of the ancient Near East and demonstrates the clever maneuvering and resilience that was to characterize the Nabateans in coming centuries. After Antigonus's army looted and made off with loads of incense and other imported goods, the Nabatean leaders protested in, quote, Syriac letters. This is probably late Aramaic or maybe early Nabatean script. Whereupon Antigonus claimed it was all a diplomatic misunderstanding, while at the same time he was preparing a follow-up campaign. But this time, the Nabateans were prepared and repulsed the attack, pursued the enemy, and routed the Greeks, even recovering the spoils taken the first time, and establishing themselves as a regional power not to be pushed around. For about the next 4 centuries, the Nabateans would accumulate incredible wealth and create a vibrant culture from a synthesis of East and West. But before fortune came fortuity. So how did the Nabateans manage on the edges of two empires, the Greek and Roman West and the Parthian East, to dominate this lucrative trade and retain independence into the 2nd century of the Roman Imperium? The century following the death of Alexander was one of intense rivalries and political shuffling. The Nabateans appear to have successfully accommodated some of their neighbors while holding off the aggressive expansionists, all the while developing the means of survival in a marginal land. Nabatean agricultural practices and water management were nothing if not ingenious. They enabled the transformation of a nomadic desert people to create a thriving urban hub, which was Petra. So how did the Nabateans, not one of the great powers of antiquity, nor a mighty nation in numbers, manage to dominate the overland trade, grow rich, and stay independent for 3 or 4 centuries of cultural brilliance? Following the death of Alexander and the scramble to control his empire, the Diadochi, as they're called, these are the generals and other important people, each trying to, or really it means successors, fought among themselves for a period of nearly 40 years. It's known as the Wars of the Diadochi. As this settled out, the more prominent successor kingdoms continued to contest boundaries and regions of influence. Particularly significant to the emergence of the kingdom of the Nabateans were the conflicts continuing for another century between Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria, which fought a series of 6 wars that took place in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Adding to the complexity of the political landscape, the Parthians, a Scythian tribe gathering power in formerly Achaemenid Persian lands, launched several campaigns against the Seleucids. It was from the chaos of this internecine warfare and rivalry that the Nabateans were able to push back and hold off those who attempted to encroach or annex Nabatean territory. These were the conflicts some identify in the book of Daniel, with the king of the north warring against the king of the south and vice versa. In effect, it was a self-inflicted dual containment that Henry Kissinger could have been proud of, but it allowed for a degree of autonomy to develop on the periphery, which the Nabateans were fully prepared to exploit. A side note on the Roman-Parthian conflict, you see the Parthian map here. It's almost, well, it's not quite as large as the Roman Empire, but in landmass, it's approaching it. The Roman famous general Pompey had, taken control of the Hasmonean territory in 63 BC. They were less successful in pushing back on the Parthians. And as the first triumvirate broke up, Julius Caesar focused on conquering Gaul. And Crassus, the billionaire, equivalent billionaire in today's terms, real estate magnate of Rome, decided to burnish his credentials and add fame to fortune. Actually, if you translate his buying power, he's probably wealthier than Elon Musk today. Maybe combined with Bill Gates. He set off on a military campaign with 7 legions, 30-some thousand soldiers, to subdue the Parthians. But in the Battle of Carrhae, near modern Haran, Turkey, the 1,000-camel resupply train of the Parthians and their horse-mounted archers with composite bows proved devastating to the Roman army, and Cassius ended up getting killed. Now, legend says that the victorious Parthians pulled molten gold in his mouth to mock his greed. Tensions between the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Parthians, whose empire was now second only to Rome at this time, prevented easy trade up through the contested regions of Mesopotamia to Syria. The Euphrates Valley remained a troubled and unstable region, which only served to channel Indian Ocean trade around the Red Sea side of the Arabian Peninsula to the Nabatean port of Leuke Kome. It's just before you get to the Gulf of Aqaba. And also overland via the Nabatean caravan networks rather than through the Persian Gulf and up the Euphrates to Syrian entry points. Of course, that worked in favor of the Nabateans. Nabatean overland routes moving from oasis to oasis across the Arabian desert would bring frankincense, myrrh, and other spices from South Arabia to their distribution center at Petra. From Petra, goods could be shipped overland to Syria or across the Negev to the Mediterranean ports, and onward to Europe. A road constructed from Petra to Gaza carried the bulk of this trade. The continued insurgencies and general instability on the eastern frontier prevented the Romans from establishing secure supply routes down the Euphrates to the east and perpetuated the Nabatean monopoly on incense routes until the end of the 1st century AD. Of all the preciosities making their way from the east into the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world, incense stands as the most important in measures of value and volume. Think of it as the oil wealth of the ancient world. Control of this resource conveyed great financial gain, and it came in varying grades. Right, you've got the sweet North Sea crude, and you've got sulfurous, sour crudes that have to be processed differently. Same thing with the incense. Some was better than others. There were a variety of balms, essences, resins, and other extracts in the markets of antiquity, but two dominated and were among the principal ingredients of temple incense blends and anointing and embalming oils. These were frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense, from the Boswellia sacra tree, was used in perfumes and as a premium incense at the sacred rituals of most of the temples of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world. It came from a scrubby tree with a more limited range than the source of myrrh, though both are of the same botanical family. The best frankincense resin was produced in the Hadramaut region of Yemen and Dhofar in Oman. I don't have a map right there, but it's right sort of where eastern Yemen and western Oman, where they kind of join. The bark of the tree was slashed in spring, and the sap that oozed out hardened into little resin droplets that were collected. As the demand increased with heavy Roman consumption, a second harvest was implemented after the monsoon season in late summer, early fall. But that resin was of lesser quality, as were sources from other regions in South Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Myrrh, from the Commiphora myrrha tree, was more widely available, coming from a broader range, though similarly produced. It was valued as an antiseptic because of an antiseptic property, and therefore used as a medicine and embalming oil, as well as for incense in temples. There's pictures of the trees. Together, these products, along with the spices, ultimately coming from India and beyond, as well as ivory, blackwood, gold, silks, were portables that had high markup potential and limited supply, all factors in the vast wealth obtained by the Nabateans. The Romans left much more by way of written records and accounts than the Nabateans. But if we look at the document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Seas, or Sea, a Greek sailor's account of trade across the Indian Ocean, we can identify many of the imported goods coming through the Arabian and Red Sea gateways. The Periplus describes a trade exchange between India, South Arabia, and the east coast of Africa, going to Egypt and the Arabian overland desert caravan routes. Talks about frankincense and myrrh from South Arabia, and items from India, such as pepper, cotton, and pearls, as well as silks coming overland from China. Up to 3/4 of the bulk of the imported Indian product was black pepper. Of course, they didn't have the chili, the red peppers yet. Those are after the Columbian Exchange with the Americas. Imagine the Nabatean caravans trundling into Petra, loaded with a breathtaking diversity of products, including Arabian frankincense, Sri Lankan and Chinese cinnamon, Indian pepper, pearls and precious stones, Chinese silks, African myrrh, ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoiseshell. In Petra's storehouses, the goods would be sorted out and sent onward to Western markets to be sold at greatly increased prices, reaping the Nabatean middlemen rich profits. For about 400 years, from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, the Nabateans were in a unique position to create wealth from this international trade. With this wealth, they developed a unique and vibrant culture, borrowing from the Hellenistic West, the Parthian East, and transforming it both into their own. In the famous poem that was awarded an Oxford Poetry Prize in 1845, and Larry quoted the last 2 lines from this, John Bergen wrote the oft-quoted final stanza. So it's already been quoted once, let's do it again, right? Match me such marvel, save in eastern clime, a rose-red city, half as old as time. The sandstone of Petra exhibits a geological feature called lasiergong banding. This is a secondary diffusion process that created colored layers cutting across beds or deposition lamination. It's not the way the sands of different colors were laid down. Lasiergong banding is secondary. It produces swirls, wavy bands, even concentric circles. The reds come mostly from iron oxides, the dark purplish to black from manganese, the yellows from sulfur compounds. With just the right light, the colors pop out. Here's some of the different colored sands of Petra, photos I took just looking at the ground. The ceremonial entrance to the city is made via the Seek, a slot canyon 3/4 of a mile long. The view then opens up to the exquisitely carved Khazner treasury, the most well-known of the rock-cut mausoleums in Petra. Let's go back one. So there you see the slot canyon, and that's Nathaniel walking by my side there. He's sitting in the back row now. Taller than me, so it's been a few years. And then you can see on the map, it's the first section of that trail, but let's continue. So it opens up, and you are then at this location where you can view more of the facades. There's a Roman theater. As you proceed around the excavated Byzantine churches, Nabatean temples, and further climbs to Nabatean high places of sacrifice, and more remote monuments. When people ask what my favorite place is, I would agree with Larry Geraty, who already said Edir, the monastery. It's the combination of remoteness, it's up a decent hike, 23 minutes I think I've done it in, but probably 45 is better. I was a bit winded. And then its sheer monumentality, spectacular. 154 feet high, I believe, and about as wide. We can see examples of a synthesis of cultures at Petra and at other of their towns and temples across the kingdom. Nowhere is this apparent as in their unique forms of architecture, or so apparent as in their architecture. The tomb facades of Petra and Madain Salah in Saudi Arabia are familiar to most, but some elements are worth examining. Nabatean tombs are a fusion of the Hellenistic and Roman styles, which blend and develop a unique Nabatean style. Some have features of clear Greek influence. They're practically parts of temples plopped into their facades. So the architraves, the pediments, metopes, triglyphs, capitals, of course. These tombs themselves are sometimes simple in the tomb part itself, but they're very complex in function, which is indicated by steps for processions and movements around, platforms, libation, holes, cisterns, water channels, and sometimes even banqueting halls. So these were places where activities took place. In the 1890s, Alfred von Domaszewski, an Austrian historian, produced a comprehensive analysis and map of the city of Petra. His typological analyses distinguished 7 types of tomb facades. He understood these to follow a temporal development, so changing through time, from purely Nabatean to incorporating Greek elements to full-on Roman temple-type tombs. Indeed, there are stylistic developments throughout the Nabatean period, but others have observed some correlation in type to social divisions and economic status, especially through an analysis of dedicatory tomb inscriptions more common at Madain Salah. So a more nuanced study of any particular tomb is necessary to evaluate all lines of evidence in constructing its place in history. Some feature obelisks along the top of the facade representing the nephesh of the departed. This is an Egyptian borrowing, repurposed for Nabatean sensibilities. Step tombs, another of Domaszewski's types, feature a uniquely Nabatean architectural element that looks like a pair of mirrored steps facing inward, descending at the top of the tomb facade. And Larry had a good picture there earlier of one of those, and here's a drawing on the left. Other features, or other tombs, feature urns or rotunda styles, or tholoi. The tholoi are typically considered a Greek feature. Are we to imagine looking over a temple at a pavilion, as some suggest? And the reference there is to this villa. It's outside of Pompeii. It was also covered by Vesuvius, and that's a painting from a fresco from inside that villa, and you can clearly see they're looking through something that almost looks like the upper layer of the chazaneh, and then you have the tholos in the background, part of the temple complex. Or is it simply an architectural embellishment? Some tombs have a triclinium for ritual feasts dedicated to the deceased. Triclinia are ubiquitous in Roman houses and halls as dining areas for the living. And of course, Nabatean sculpture, we won't go in depth into that. But let's get further and talk about one of the stories that goes with one of the kings of the Nabateans. The Herod dynasty had a convoluted and sometime fraught relationship with the Nabatean kingdom and royal family. Herod's father, Antipater, an Idumean or Edomite, married Cypris, the daughter of the Nabatean royal family. She bore 4 children, including the son later known as Herod the Great. While his father had good relations with the Nabateans, Herod was more complicated. When the Parthians attacked Jerusalem in 40 BC, in the continuum of the Roman-Parthian conflict, Herod fought a rearguard battle as he fled southward, left his family in Masada, considered going on to Petra, but apparently he wasn't as welcome there, perhaps for the negative attention it might draw in the conflict, and Herod journeyed on to Rhodes and Rome. Herod the Great had governed several decades when Aretas IV, and that's his picture here on a coin, ascended the throne of the Nabateans. Aretas IV is one of the best-known kings and long-lived as well. He reigned from 9 BC to 40 AD. In his inscriptions, he takes the title Aretas, King of the Nabateans, friend of his people. Indeed, his people seem to prosper during his reign, and the usual archaeological interpretation identifies the chazaneh, or this treasury, as his mausoleum. Following the death of Herod the Great, his son, Herod Antipas, was made Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. There's 2 separated areas highlighted on the map. Perea was the region east of the Jordan River, contiguous to the Nabatean kingdom. Antipas married Phasael, or Phasaelis in Greek. They probably got married in the year 86 or 7 when she was almost a teenager, and were married for over 20 years. But that's where the famous part begins. Herod Antipas traveled to Rome and there became involved in a very public and scandalous affair with Herodias, the wife of his half-brother, Herod Philip. Now, Philip has often been confused with Philip the Tetrarch, whose territory was north and east of the Dead Sea, of the Sea of Galilee. But the writings of Josephus and others allow us to sort out and disambiguate the variant names. Herod Antipas then planned to divorce his Nabatean wife, Phasaelis, and marry Herodias, following her divorce from Herod Philip. It was this situation that John the Baptist condemned, and when Salome, Herodias' daughter, and Herod Antipas' stepdaughter, danced for Herod and company, that Herodias requested the execution of John. Now, it may be of interest that Herodias herself was the granddaughter of the beautiful and charming Hasmonean princess Mariamne I, who married Herod the Great and whom he executed out of jealousy and growing paranoia. Then he put her in a jar of honey to preserve her for a while because he was quite devastated he was now without his dear Mariamne. And he was delighted then when he found another woman with the same name, Mariamne. And the problem was she was a commoner, but he solved that. He elevated her father to high priest, and then, well, problem solved. The second Mariamne was the mother of Herod Philip, the one in Rome married to Herodias. So Salome, the young dancing queen, was the granddaughter of both Mariamnes, one via her father, the other through her mother. So there was a lot of treachery and premature death in the Herodian lineage. When Phasaelis learned of the affair and ascertained her husband's intentions to be done with her, she was concerned for her safety. She made an excuse to visit the fortress of Machaerus overlooking the Dead Sea, where John the Baptist, by the way, was executed. And during the night, her courtiers helped her slip over the border into her father's kingdom, and then she made her way to Petra and safety. The divorce of Phasaelis led to an irreparable fracture of relations between Aretas IV and Antipas, and eventual war. Antipas suffered devastating losses and, in an attempt to win over imperial support, traveled to Rome. But there his nephew Herod Agrippa, this is Herodias' full-blood brother, schemed against him and spreading rumors of treachery, with the result that Antipas was exiled to Lugdunum in Gaul, now Lyon, France, where he lived out the remainder of his days, Herodias with him. There's a lot of detail that we won't go into about the later years, the Roman annexation, but there were two final kings of the Nabateans that accounted for about 50 years, and upon the death of the last, King Rabbel II, in AD 106, the Roman Emperor Trajan annexed the Nabatean kingdom, which became the province of Arabia, with its provincial capital at Petra. The process seems to have gone without a struggle. At least we have no account of any battle. The life in Petra continued to flourish for a time. With Roman control came new building activity, a theater, colonnaded streets, more monuments. In AD 131, Hadrian visited Petra and bestowed upon it the title, whether desired or not, Hadriane Petra, basically Hadrian's Petra. With the Romans' control of the trade routes, much of it shifted northward to Syria. In the 2nd century AD, Palmyra rose to preeminence as the wealthy gateway to the Roman Empire, and Petra declined. I have a couple of pictures of Palmyra in memory of what it used to look like, now destroyed. I must decrease that thou might increase would be applicable here, and by the end of the 2nd century, the trade road from Petra to Gaza was abandoned. Though Petra declined, it remained a religious center in the 3rd and 4th centuries, with a population largely sustained by local farming. With the increasing transition of the majority population to Christianity, Petra became the seat of a bishopric, which it held into the 5th and 6th centuries AD. The population further declined, and in the early Islamic period, though, was of some strategic importance during the Crusades. By the time of the European Age of Exploration, Petra was little known beyond the communities of local Bedouin until its popularization by Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812, and a spate of travelers followed in his footsteps in the subsequent decades of the early 1800s. As Alexander lay dying in Babylon in the year 322, he had one last plan that would die with him unfulfilled. It had been his dream to conquer Arabia and control the sources of the incense production. He had conquered Egypt and planted Hellenistic cities as frontiers of Hellenism along the eastern borders of southern Syria and Jordan. The cities of the Decapolis, as they became known, included such sites as Pella, Scythopolis, Gadara, Gerasa, which is Jerash, and Philadelphia, the modern city of Amman. But Alexander's next campaign, Arabia, was not to be. It is sometimes said that the hinges of history turn on small circumstances, and that if rerun, would probably pivot differently. But if Alexander had lived and had seen his vision through, we would not be here tonight, remembering the amazing achievements of the Nabateans and Petra, the rose-red city half as old as time.